한국행정연구원의 안성호 원장입니다. 오늘 우리 이사장님이 인사 말씀을 하게 되어 있는데 한 10여 분 좀 늦으신다고 그래서 제가 대신 인사 말씀을 드리고 이제 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 경제 인문사회연구회 산하의 연구기관 원장님 또 기타 보직자 여러분들 그리고 전문가 여러분 이렇게 참여해 주셔서 진심으로 감사드립니다. 오늘 특별히 미국에서 먼 걸음을 해주신 윌리엄 스틴넷 박사님에게 다 같이 한번 박수 한번 쳐주시기 바랍니다. 세종국가리더십위원회는 작년부터 지금까지 9회째 포럼을 하고 있습니다. 세종국가리더십포럼은 리더십의 역사와 철학, 미래 비전을 나누는 담론의 장을 마련해 왔습니다. 오늘은 스틴넷 박사님을 모시고 How Leaders Build Trust, How Trust in an Organization Overcomes Fear. 여러분 보시다시피 신뢰 문제를 공부하도록 하겠습니다. 이제 오늘 이 제목을 보니까 신뢰를 구축하는 것은 두려움을 없애는 것이다. 이런 주제를 가지고 말씀을 해주시는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 신뢰를 얘기하면은 우리는 뭐 익히 잘 아는 생각이 나죠. 특히 정부와 관련해서 신뢰하면은 노노의 안연편을 보면 제자 자공이 공자 선생님한테 정치와 행정의 본질이 뭡니까? 뭐라고 생각하십니까? 이렇게 물어보니까 공자 선생님이 먹을 것을 충분히 마련해 주는 것, 이게 첫째다. 둘째는 족병, 그래서 안보, 질서를 지켜주는 거. 이게 정치의 또 하나의 본질이다. 세 번째가 민신, 그래서 민의 신뢰를 얻는 것이다. 자공이 다시 물었습니다. 이 중에 부득이 하나를 포기해야 한다면 뭘 포기합니까? 그러니까 족병을 포기해. 난 족병을 포기하겠다. 질서와 안보, 이거 포기할 수 있다. 또 하나 부득이 또 포기한다면 뭘 포기하십니까? 그랬더니 먹는 거, 족식을 포기하겠다. 이분이, 이 공자 선생님이 2400~500년 전에 정치의 본질에 또 행정의 본질에 가장 중요한 걸 민의 신뢰를 얻는 것이다. 트러스트의 중요성을 이렇게 강조해주고 있습니다. 왜 이렇게 민신이 중요합니까? 하고 물으니까 공자 선생님이 민이 나라를 믿지 않으면 나라가 설 수 없기 때문이다. 이 나라의 존재는 이 신뢰, 국민의 신뢰에 바탕하지 않으면 안 된다 하는 이런 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 작년에 우리 한국인들이 정부를 얼마나 신뢰하는가를 재봤더니 36%가 신뢰한다고 그랬습니다. 그 전해에 28%였는데 좀 올랐죠. 이제 정부가 바뀌면서 조금 신뢰도가 오른 건 사실입니다. 그런데 OECD 평균이 작년에 42%였습니다. 그러니까 OECD보다도 훨씬 낮은 평균보다 낮은 상태에 있다. 세계에서 가장 신뢰도가 높은 나라가 어느 나라인지 아세요? 스위스입니다. 82%의 정부 신뢰도를 가지고 있습니다. 오늘 제가 미리 유인물을 보니까 신뢰가 높으면 조직의 성과도 생산성도 높아진다. 이윤도 많아진다. 이 얘기를 아주 굉장히 강조하시는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 그런데 스위스는 이 신뢰가 세계에서 가장 높은 나라인데 스위스 미러클을 성취한 나라. 정말 자원도 없는 나라고 정말 젊은이들의 피를 팔아서 나라 살림을 꾸려나가던 스위스가 세계가 주목하는 세계 최고의 번영 국가를 만들었다. 이거는 제가 볼 때는 이 신뢰 문제와 직결되어 있다는 생각을 갖습니다. 오늘 스틴넷 박사님이 이 문제를 본격적으로 얘기해 주실 때 우리에게 많은 깨달음이 있으리라고 생각합니다. 우리 스틴넷 박사님이 나오시기 전에 우리 스틴넷 박사님의 양력을 간단하게 소개해 드리겠습니다. 우리 스틴넷 박사님은 고든 트레이닝 인터내셔널의 부회장 겸 마스터 트레이너십니다. 그리고 현재 휴먼 프로덕티비티 센터의 회장을 겸하고 계십니다. 그리고 과거에는 허니웰에서 매니저를 하셨는데 그때의 그 팀 베이스드 매니지먼트 시스템을 개발하고 시행해 가지고 생산성을 일거에 330%를 증진시켰고 생산비를 50% 감축한 이런 획기적인 성과를 거둔 이런 리더십 또 매니지먼트의 컨설턴트십니다. 원래 그 아리조나 주립대학교의 커뮤니케이션 학과에서 교수 생활도 하셨고요. 지금까지 한 10,000명 정도의 정부 관계자들 또 이기제큐티브 이 경영진들을 교육을 해오셨다고 그럽니다. 전 세계에서 여러 곳에 방문하셔가지고 오늘과 같은 이런 스피치 또 프레젠테이션을 해준 것으로 되어 있습니다. 특히 그 아마존.com, 월트 디즈니, 이미지니어링, 보잉, 하니웰 등의 이런 컨설팅 내용 교육을 통해서 이들 기업들 조직을 일신시키는데 크게 기여해 오신 것으로 되어 있습니다. 오늘 이렇게 귀중한 걸음을 해주신 스틴넷 박사님에게 다시 한번 감사드리고 1시간 동안 말씀을 듣고 그 후에 약 1시간 동안 Q&A 타임을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 지금 나오실 때 우리 이사장님 한 말씀 해주실까요? 예. 그러면 이따가 토론 시간에 또 말씀해 주시는 걸로 하고요. 오늘 스틴넷 박사님이 나오시겠습니다. 그럼 박수로 맞아주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Ist 무슨 wire response is power okay. Is it you should use this micro response you use the test.
Test.
Yeah. Okay.
안녕하세요. So I'm most honored to have been invited to give this talk this evening. Many auspicious participants in this session. So I add just a little bit to the wonderful. I was so flattered and so honored by your introduction. It was lovely. Makes me sound so important. Yes. But I moved to Arizona in the southwest part of the United States. And I moved there to teach at Arizona State University. I loved teaching. It was a wonderful profession. And many of you have, at some point in your career, been teachers as well. But I recall being excited by being around young people. They have much energy, new ideas. So it's very stimulating. But I also remember students asking embarrassing questions. And I would be lecturing and they would raise their hands. And I would call on them. And they would say, "That sounds pretty good, but would that really work?" And the only answer at the time that I was prepared to give them was that it should work. It ought to work. The theory suggests that that would work. It was not a very satisfying answer for them or for me. So I decided to go to work in the real world. And at the time, I believed the real world was business and industry. So I took a job at Honeywell. And I worked at Honeywell for 5 years. I'm not sure whether that was the real world or not, but I learned a great deal. And following that experience, I went into business for myself. And it has been a wonderful journey, and I've learned a great deal from all of the companies and municipalities that I have done work for. So that brings me to today. Again, I'm honored to be here. I've been here a few times in the past. And when I was asked to do this, what topic seems to be pertinent for leaders, I came also to offer an overview workshop on a class called Leader Effectiveness Training. And so that's a training that specializes in teaching communication skills to people in leadership roles. And one of the key elements of that training and that learning and those skills is that trust is central to this model. It simply cannot and will not work without a very high level of trust. And so I wanted to share some of my experiences in working with companies and helping them improve the level of trust. And if you remember, there was a consultant named W. Edwards Deming. And Deming, following the Second World War, was one of the American consultants who helped Japan rebuild their industry. And he was invited to Japan after trying to convince many American manufacturers to adopt his quality improvement process, and was met with sort of ho-hum response. But in Japan, he was very successful. And one of his key principles was to drive fear out of the organization. The central management and leadership model up to that time in the United States and in Japan was a top-down model that used authoritarian tactics to force people to comply with the needs of management. And Deming said, as long as you employ that model of leadership, your productivity will always be limited. It doesn't mean that that won't work at all, but it means it can only take you so far. If you want true high performance, you must allow people to go much beyond that. So the opposite of fear, of course, is trust, or the opposite of trust is fear. In a low trust organization, let's talk about what that looks like, what that feels like. One thing that people do in a low trust organization is they withhold information. The people who know most about what is happening in any business, whether that's a government organization or whether that's a factory, whether it's a bank, if people are afraid, they close themselves up and they become reluctant to share information. And in its extreme, this puts management in a very difficult position, does it not? So if you're the leader of that organization and people are not telling you what the problems are, that increases considerably the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake, that you're going to make a decision that is bad for the business. People retreat. They go into their shells. They become less engaged. And engagement is one of those words that we use to talk about people who become like part of the organization. They feel that they belong. And if you feel that you belong in a place, you're more likely to work hard. You're more likely to be careful. You're more likely to try to anticipate problems and prevent problems from occurring. So that's what engagement is about. It's about energy, it's about commitment, it's about all of those things. But if I don't trust you, it's much more difficult to muster up those sorts of feelings. And as a result, people give less of what we call discretionary effort. You can force people to work. We all know that that's possible. All of us have been in that kind of organization at some time. But if you want people to go the extra mile, if you want people to give you new ideas, if you want people to roll up their sleeves and say, you know, I can make that happen, they won't do it in the other kind of organization. They won't do it if they feel like they're being forced. People have more stress. And I don't know what it's like here, but I know back in the US, healthcare costs are extremely high. And stress leads to all kinds of healthcare problems. It leads to high blood pressure, it leads to depression, it leads to anxiety, and all of these things cost money. Either if the government is paying for it or if your company is paying for it, high levels of stress cost money. It comes right out of your pocket. When people are stressed, they also make more errors. They make mistakes. And sometimes when they make mistakes, if they're afraid, what do they try to do? Try to cover it up. Or they assign blame. Or they pretend it didn't happen. Finger pointing. Right? Okay. If something goes wrong, it's your fault, not mine. Somebody else's fault. Okay. They screwed up, right? They messed up. That kind of behavior takes up a lot of time and energy in any company. You know the term gossip, and we talk about water cooler conversations. Those are the informal conversations that we have in private when we think nobody's watching, right? And a lot of times those conversations are about, you know, what I can get away with, or, you know, whose fault that was, and who's going to get fired, and whose brother-in-law got hired, you know. So those kinds of conversations tend to be very common in the low-trust organizations. People are afraid to collaborate. They're afraid to cooperate. Because the last thing you want to do is have someone else get credit for your work. So, I'm a lot less likely to call on you for help. I'm a lot less likely to respond if you ask me for help. You know, it's more, not only are people less likely to trust their managers and their leaders, but they're less likely to trust one another. And we're not creative. We're not creative in this kind of organization. Very difficult to convince people to come up with new ideas if they're afraid that they won't get credit for it, that someone else will take credit for it, that you will take that idea and run with it, and they won't have any reward for having done that. So there is no or little incentive for people to be creative in that kind of organization. So people hold back. Yeah, and people pretend to be busy, right? Pretend to be busy. You know, if I'm the supervisor in your company, and I'm coming around and watching to see you working, get busy, right? She's not, well, now see what happened when I walked away, all right? She crossed her arms and sat back in her chair, right? But you know what? If I come back again, what'll you do? You get busy again, right? Okay, so people pretend. And people play games. There was one story I was going to share with you. Let me go ahead. Yeah. This last one is another sort of form of games. This last one is called malicious obedience. Malicious obedience. Does that ring a bell to you? See, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do exactly what you told me to do, knowing full well that it's going to mess things up. I had an assignment in a company that built these huge machines. They were some kind of compressor, and each one of these machines was very costly. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was like $100,000 US dollars. They delivered one of these machines to one of their important clients, and it did not work. And so they sent it back to the factory to find out why not. So they were disassembling it and reverse engineering and trying to figure out what actually happened. And as they took it apart, they started to realize that one of the primary components in this machine had been installed upside down. And it was obvious to everyone who worked in this factory that it could not possibly perform its function. And they went to the people who built the machine, and they said, "Why did you do that?" Clearly, they knew that it could not possibly work. And the answer, of course, was what? That's what it said in the specifications. In other words, that's what you told us to do. This is what we call malicious obedience. This is a way of fighting back, isn't it? In the booklet that you have before you, I have some words in there. I have a number of paragraphs. I'm not going to go through all of those, but there are a number of examples of studies that have been done in the past 10, 15 years or so that talks about companies and their productivity. And it's not just one thing that they looked at, but they looked at a lot of factors. They looked at team programs. They looked at employee benefit programs. They looked at time off programs. They looked at programs to support education. All of those sorts of interventions. And what they found was that the higher the company scored on those kinds of practices, the higher their productivity. This is not ambiguous. Right? It's very clear that the companies that spent more, invested more, and paid more attention to the needs of the people who work there had better performance. This is not a secret, and this is not a new idea. So the companies with the more engaged employees have increased operating incomes, and engaged employees require less supervision. One of the problems with highly autocratic organizations or low trust organizations is to make that work, you have to watch people all the time. So if I have an organization and you work for me in this organization and I'm the boss, and I tell you, here's how you have to do it, okay? And I'm going to pay attention and make sure you keep doing it exactly the right way all the time. Now, I can get him to do what he's supposed to do, but I have to watch him all the time. And that costs money. That costs money. One of my early experiences at Honeywell was with a factory where we developed a team process. And you mentioned that in the introduction, that it resulted in more than tripling their productivity. But what it also did was we were able to eliminate an entire level of supervision. We no longer needed first-level supervisors at all. So that saved a lot of money right there. Discretionary effort increases. Managers become more aware of potential problems. People are more creative, and there's less unnecessary conflict. When I was first hired, one of my early assignments was in a factory where, again, we were implementing a team process, and you make big changes like this in an organization, it always creates a certain amount of conflict. People are uncomfortable with change. People's roles change. So people become a little unsure. And so there's a great deal of conflict. And the supervisors and managers had come to me and my boss at the time and said, we can't get on board with this unless you can show us how to deal with this conflict more effectively. And so my job became how to teach these managers or these employees to resolve conflict. But once the trust starts to build, the conflict starts to go down. It doesn't go away, but what happens is people learn how to resolve it effectively. There's always conflict, right? This is a normal part of all human relationships. But knowing how to get it resolved becomes very, very important. Okay. One of the reasons that we were able to triple the output in the early factory was that people stopped making certain kinds of errors. One of the things that happened in this factory was we opened the books. I think I will mention this again in a little while. Unless there was information that was, absolutely proprietary, or it was personal information, it was inappropriate to share. Otherwise, all of the financial information, productivity information about the factory was open. As a matter of fact, we even conducted workshops to teach people how to read a spreadsheet, how to read a profit loss statement, so we taught them some of the math, how to read, understand, and know how much their job was contributing and how much things cost. I remember as the productivity increased, we started to get very senior executives to come to this factory to find out what was happening. Right? There were some of them who actually thought we were making things up. Right? They said, this can't be real. And so they came to the factory to tour the factory, and they were going to try to catch us in the act. They figured we were doing something that wasn't quite correct. But the interesting thing is they would go around from station to station to station, and they would ask questions of these first-level workers. And one of the things that was fascinating was that at any point in this process, these people could hold up their product that they were working on at that moment And they knew exactly how much that had cost to get it to that point in the process. And every factory worker was able to answer those questions. So we allowed people to be a part of the business. One of the things that occurred was that this first factory was separate. The division was about 5,000 or 6,000 people. But this one factory was sort of a standalone. It was in a different physical location. And I call it the mothership, the big corporate location. Put together what was a reduced absenteeism program. And they had all sorts of rewards and bonuses and all of that sort of thing attached to it. But our factory was exempt from the program, because we were doing all of this team stuff and all of that sort of thing. We were not required to participate in the reduced absenteeism program. But the interesting thing that occurred is after a year in the big division, the mothership, the absenteeism rate was still exactly the same. But in this factory, the absenteeism rate went down to almost 1%. Almost unheard of. Right? We actually had to tell people to go home because they were coming to work sick, because they didn't want to miss anything. So absenteeism rates declined. I was doing some work in a company on the East Coast, and this was a company, this is on grievances decline. This company was not yet a union shop, but there was a lot of conversation and a lot of activity around whether they would become a union shop. And so there was a lot of tension, and there were also a lot of grievances being filed. And a lot of months there would be 100, 200 grievances filed. So it was a very tense situation. But we did some leadership training, we did some team building, we did some team process work, and over a period of about 2 years, the actual rate of grievances fell to the point where we were getting 1 or 2 per month. From 1 or 200 per month to 1 or 2 per month. Now the managers would look at those grievances and say, these are actually legitimate grievances. These are things that we should indeed be working on. Customer complaints decline. Risk is reduced. We'll talk about risk a little bit more later on. So why is it that people don't trust their leaders? And this first bullet up there says managers lie. Well, I guess everyone does sometimes, right? But sometimes people just don't tell the truth. And there are a lot of reasons that people don't tell the truth. Some of those reasons are, it's secret, so I'm not allowed to talk about it, or it's proprietary, I really shouldn't talk about it, or I'm trying to accumulate power and I don't want people to know that I'm doing that, or. And we know what many of those reasons are, but a lot of times those catch up with us. And if they do, people recognize that and they remember that. They remember that. And we have sometimes a bad history with management. In some companies, I'll find that, I'll find a manager that I find is a wonderful person. They're talented, they're intelligent, they're really working hard to engage people in the company's business, but people still don't want to trust them. And I've talked to these people and they'll say, my last manager was awful. You know, and I tried to be a good team player and tried to come up with new ideas. I got hurt. I got hurt. Now, I'm not taking a chance again. And it just is a low-trust environment. We have a stereotype view of management. So anyone who gets promoted to management, we're not supposed to trust them anymore. People who were good friends. Right? This person gets promoted to management, and all of a sudden, I don't trust them anymore. For no other reason than they are a manager. So why is it hard? You know, we have a lot of obstacles to overcome. And one is, trusting someone means to take a certain amount of risk, doesn't it? You know, if I trust you to do something, there's always something at stake. So there's some risk involved. And one of the bullets up here is that we, in general, I don't know about here, but back home in the States, we are not really very good at assessing risk. There are a lot of consulting companies and legal outfits who make a huge amount of money helping companies avoid risk. So that's a profitable business. But in general, as a culture, we are not very good at this. And if you think about the things that we are afraid of, we're afraid of terrorism, we're afraid of violence, we're afraid of being hit by a meteor, we're afraid of vaccines, right? So there are a lot of things that we're afraid of, but if you really look at most of those events, they are extremely rare events. And I think about comparing some of those kinds of things with how many people die in automobile accidents. We have like 40,000 people a year die in automobile accidents. I mean, can you imagine proposing a transportation system in which you say, gee, everybody will be able to go wherever they want in their own vehicle. We just have to be willing to lose 40,000 people every year, right? So we would be laughed out of the room. Okay? But yet that's exactly what we've done. And the same thing happens in organizations. One person will do something wrong, or two people will do something wrong. You know, they charge something on an expense report that maybe they shouldn't have. And so we put a new rule in place. Okay? Somebody else does something wrong. We put another rule in place. And at some point, we have a bureaucratic nightmare. I did a fair amount of work for a company that was a big government contractor. And security was very important. The product itself was secret. And to improve their accountability, every time something went wrong, they would have some other manager who had to sign off on it before it was a go. I remember looking at some of these documents, and a fairly simple procedure sometimes had, I remember one that had 11, 12, 13 names, people who had to sign off on it. And I remember talking to these people who had to sign off, and they were saying, well, did you actually look at this procedure before you signed off on it? I said, no. You know, George signed off on it, and if George signs off on it, I know it's fine. I asked George, right? Did you actually read that document on that procedure? No. Sally signed off on it. If Sally signed off on it, I know it's okay because I trust her. Okay. But they are not actually improving accountability. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. Right? It's the opposite. Anyway, not good at assessing risk. Too much vigilance. There's a story supervisor got it in his head. There was a process in place where they had to disassemble a number of products, and there were very, very small parts, and there were a lot of them. They had to disassemble them and reassign these parts and restock them. And it was very tedious, boring work. Nobody wanted to do this job, but they had workers sitting at cubicles, sorting these tiny, tiny little parts. And they would talk to each other, right? And, the supervisor decided that was just not okay. If you're talking, you're not working. And so, he'd try to catch them in the act so he could punish them. And one day what he did is he came in early and he took a tape recorder and taped it underneath one of the desks. So he was going to get evidence, catch them, talking to one another. And of course, it's a stupid thing to do. It was probably illegal anyway. But I remember once we found out what he had been doing, we talked about it, and we ended up saying, rather than having everybody sit at their own little cube and count these things, put them at a round table. Let them talk all they want. And of course, what do you think happened? Productivity went through the roof. The cure is worse than the disease. Sometimes the things we do to try to get people to comply can actually make things worse. The story I just told, I think, illustrates that. And playing it safe can actually reduce trust. If I have to be copied on every single thing that you do, just because I don't want us to make a mistake, at some point, that's a formula for mediocrity. That's a formula for mediocrity. So how do you change that? Tell the truth and listen. One of the most difficult challenges I found in this kind of work is teaching people how to listen. And you hear people sometimes say, just listen, as though somehow listening is not doing something. But what I found is that listening takes an enormous amount of energy. I mean, how many times have you really tried to sit and just listen to someone for some significant period of time? It takes a lot of concentration. It takes a lot of energy. And listening is a skill that can be taught. It can be learned. So I don't know about you, but as a child, when I was going to school, my teachers encouraged me to learn to speak and to write and to communicate and talk. But no one ever sat me down and taught me how to listen until I was an adult. But it's a skill like any other skill. And it's a very difficult one to master. And if any of you have ever been in a situation where you've had some sort of very serious problem, and you have someone who was able to really listen to you, one of the examples I used yesterday, I went to a doctor a few weeks ago, and getting older, so like anybody, there's always this and that and the other thing. And I was talking to the doctor, and I said, wow, I've always been resilient. I've always been able to bounce back. And I'm starting to feel like it's harder and harder to bounce back. And this doctor looked at me, and he said, you are really starting to think about your own mortality. And I thought, Yes. Yes. Most of the time, what a doctor would do or say in that situation is, don't worry about it, I'll give you a pill. Don't worry about it, we'll give you an operation. But what this doctor did was let me know that he was really listening to what I had to say. And that feels very, very different. Give direct, specific feedback. Don't skimp. Don't avoid. Good news, bad news, both. I've had managers come and tell me, and talk about giving people feedback. How do you learn to do something better? You have to have feedback, right? Any kind of skill, anything that you do to get better, you have to have feedback. And I'll hear from employees or team members, they'll say, we never get any feedback. We don't know if we're doing our job right or not. And I asked the manager, why aren't you giving them feedback? And honestly, I've had them say, I'm saving it up for the performance review. I mean, think about that. Okay. I'm going to save it up for the performance review. No. I mean, when do people need feedback if they're going to improve their performance? Now. You know, I mentioned W. Edward Deming earlier. Do you know what he says about performance reviews? Anyone? He said, don't do them at all. Says feedback should happen now, today, every day. Don't skimp on development. If there's an opportunity for someone to learn something new, make sure they have it. In most of the factories where we did the team process, one of the key elements of that was new learning. I talked a little bit ago about teaching people how to read spreadsheets and how to read the financial statements, but also education on new skills, because the more skills that people have, the more powerful the team becomes. Avoid cliches. Again, I don't know what it's like here in your culture, but back in the States, it's like, you know, we make up words. I pulled up behind a car one day, and there was a bumper sticker. And the bumper sticker said, I'd rather be dead than empowered. I mean, think about that. I mean, empowerment, I mean, this is a great idea, right? We want our people to feel powerful. But this phrase had been so overused wherever this person worked that it had just become management happy talk. It was not contributing to anyone's productivity. We're going to talk more about responding to team member concerns in a little bit, and so I'll come back to that one. And resolve conflicts, and it says win-win. Part of the communication skills program that I teaches a no-lose or a win-win conflict resolution model. And one of the conversations that always occurs when I'm teaching that is people say that's unrealistic. You can't always resolve a conflict win-win. Probably true in a way, not 100% of the time. But what I've found is if the leader of the organization, the leadership in the organization, is truly committed to trying to find win-win solutions to problems, even in those instances where that's not possible, people still feel better. They'll think, you know what? We gave it a really good try. Maybe now is the time for some compromise or something else. Or maybe I just need to do what I'm told. But if I know that every time there's a conflict, what you'll do is make a genuine effort to find a solution that not only meets your needs, but meets mine as well. I will feel a whole lot better about working here. So trust is not a single thing. It's a combination of belief, feeling, and action. Right? I have to believe what you say, I have to feel safe, and I have to witness actions that are consistent with that if I'm going to trust you. So it's not just one thing. Have you ever had anybody tell you, trust me? You ever heard that phrase? Do you believe them? You're too nice, yeah. But once someone says, trust me, right, it's like the sign that says, keep off the grass. I had never even thought about stepping on that grass until I saw the sign there, right? So trust me makes me think, I wonder why they felt the need to tell me that. So, and what if you just don't trust this other person? What if? What do you do about that? I mean, sometimes, we don't. And we don't even have any good reason for that. But how do I change that? So let's say I want you to take the money to the bank for me. I don't know why that would be important, but let's say it is. It'd be very convenient if you took the money to the bank for me. Will you do that for me? Talk about that. But I don't trust him. I don't know why, I just don't. So what are my choices? What can I do about that? I can take it myself. It takes extra time and effort and it's inconvenient. I could have someone else do it. He'll never learn, I'll take responsibility if I do that. I could have him followed. Someone shadowing. I could let him do it. I could give him part of the money. But the point of that is not which of those is the correct option. But the point of that is if I want that situation to change, who is it who must do something different? See, if I just sit and wait for him to become trustworthy, what happens? Because the idea, not trustworthy, exists only inside my head. How do you fix that? Yeah, trust is fragile. To build trust, the leader's commitment must be real, it must be visible, and it must be perceived as real by the team members. Perceived as real sometimes is hard to achieve. What I often talk about here is in my country, many, many years ago, in Salem, Massachusetts, we had the witch trials. You heard of the Salem witch trials? Anybody? Yeah. And so there was this period in our history where if anyone was accused of being a witch, they had to pass a test. And here's the test. They, arrested the person, and then they tied them to a chair, and they dunked the chair under the water. Now, if they survived, well, if they died, okay, if they drowned, that was evidence they were not a witch, and they were presumed innocent, right? On the other hand, if you survived, that was proof you were a witch. Then they burned you at the stake, right? Okay. So it was not a fair test, really, not quite. And, you know, managers sometimes tell me that the tests they have to pass to prove themselves don't feel fair, right? I don't think it's quite as extreme, but nonetheless, sometimes it doesn't feel fair. But the point of this is that if you're in the leadership role, you're the one who has to prove that you are trustworthy. Being trustworthy is step one. Proving it is the challenge. And this chart illustrates one way to achieve this. And this is a process that I use in all of the team interventions that I've done. And all teams, productivity, and the IPT means internal productivity teams. That's what the acronym stands for. But all of those production teams or organizational teams or first level clerical teams, one thing they should always do is solve problems. They should be taught problem-solving skills. They should be taught the skills to present ideas to senior management. And they should do all of that kind of work. But the other thing that teams at that level should be expected, permitted, and expected to do is that problems that are outside either their scope of ability or their scope of authority, they should have a mechanism for elevating those ideas to senior management, the leadership team. Okay? And oftentimes what would happen is the leadership team would make some agreements about how to respond to these issues that were elevated. And we had some rules around that. And rule number one was any issue that was elevated was responded to. This is 100%. Nothing was ever just left hanging. So every single issue received a response. There were 3 acceptable kinds of responses. One response would be a yes. Okay, that's a good idea. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how we'll handle it. And something happened right away. Second acceptable answer. It's a good idea. We don't have the resources right now, but someone is assigned to work on that, and they're given a date to give you a yes or a no on that. And that person has a name and a face. The team who identified the issue is allowed to check with them for status, bug them about it, and it's up to the team whether the issue is open or closed. And the third answer that's perfectly acceptable is no. But if the answer is no, there are 2 more rules that apply. Number one, you have to have a reason to say no. You can't just say no and leave it be. The second rule is you have to do that face to face. To go to the team and say, no, we're not going to do that, and here's the reason we're not going to do it. And what that does is give an opportunity then for people to talk about that, maybe think of some other way to solve the problem. And ultimately, if the problem remains unsolved, it sometimes remains unsolved, but it doesn't mean it goes away. The only person who can remove an issue from the list is the person who identified the problem. And we would anticipate sometimes that there would be 30 or 40 of these kinds of issues. Remember, the first few times we did this, there were hundreds of them. There were hundreds of them. And one of the results of that was that the managers spent a lot of time trying to respond to all these issues. And sometimes we got pushback. The managers would say, we don't have time to do that. It's taking time away from our other duties. You know, those other reports that we have to write, that those people who are above us expect us to do. I said, okay, let's look at those other duties. Right? How many of those other duties really are things that you must do? And lo and behold, there was a significant handful of reports and duties that really didn't need to be done. These were things they'd been doing for years just because they'd been doing them for years. And what they finally understood was our job is to respond to these issues. This is what leaders are supposed to do. And surprisingly, over time, what happens? People start believing what their leaders tell them. If an idea is no good, I know what's going to happen. That person or that team or that leader is going to come to me and tell me yes or no or who's in charge of fixing it. And it happens every single time. Over time, what starts to happen is the trust starts to go up and up and up. Do I have time to tell one more little story? Or are we out of time? Can I tell one more story? Yes. One more story. Circuit board factory, and the productivity had been going up and up and up and up, and things were getting better and better and better. But they were making electronic panels that went into multi-layer circuit boards that went into large mainframe computers. And they had gotten to the point where they were making about 2,800 of these per week. But the main plant one week had a huge demand, and they came to the factory manager and said, could you possibly produce 5,500 of these? It was a huge number for them. Plant manager didn't even know if that was possible. He got all his engineers together. He says, is it feasible? Is it technically possible to actually do this? And they said, yes. If no one's absent, nothing goes wrong, everything runs like clockwork, by about 2 or 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, we could have that job done. Plant manager gathered everybody together and said, here's the challenge. If we can do 5,500 panels before the week is done, I'll let everybody have the rest of the time off with pay. He got into some trouble for that because he wasn't really allowed to do that, but he did it anyway. And of course, what happened was Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, they're done. So they're done a complete day ahead of time. And the point of this story is, if they did not have a very high level of trust in this plant manager, they would never have done that. Because their belief was, boy, if we do this once, then they'll just move the goalpost, we call it. All right. These are my conclusions. It's very difficult to create a high trust organization. They always outperform low trust organizations, always. And, but it's worth it. So, thank you.
예, 예. 안 해봤어요.